Hello, welcome to Cave of the Cross Apologetics. I'm Patrick.
And I'm Tony.
And this is the show where you pull off the books off your bookshelf that you should be reading, and you can read along with us, or you can just listen to us, pull the bookshelf off, and read what... Actually, we've already read this book that we're covering, but we try and go through a book that is apologetic based, that we then cover chapter by chapter and kind of get into the milieu of the language that you might not know or aren't exactly sure where the author's coming from, and we kind of break it down chapter by chapter. So if you're here, we appreciate you joining us, and we're in the middle of our book, Faith Has Its Reasons, by Kenneth and Robert M. Bowman Jr. And for this book, they're taking a look at four different methods of apologetics: the classical, the evidentialist, the reformed, and the fideist position. And they say, let's look at the strengths, the weakness, the history of them, what they answer, how they answer 6 different meta-apologetics, 6 questions of apologetics, and then see what their weaknesses are from there, and also their strengths, and see if there's a better way, or if there's a single way that our authors are going to recommend. And so we've kind of done the intro already, and we've done the first portion of our book, which covers the classical model. The classical model has this 2-step approach. The first one is to prove that there is a God, or at least a creator, initial creator. And then the second one is to show that Jesus is that second step that makes it a Christian worldview. And they emphasize reason and logic as part of their apologetic. And so now we've covered that, and you can check the past episodes for that. And here we're covering the evidentialist approach, which is just the facts. So they're the Joe Friday of our apologetic. And if you need to know who Joe Friday is, then we might have to Google a little bit more to figure out with the Dragnet reference there.
So I might also say they since they come at this these 4 positions from such many-sided areas, it's a really thorough book in terms of what they do. Right? They look at several angles, as you mentioned, history and how they deal with particular questions and issues, and there's meta-apologetic questions that they have. So it's a really good book if you want to get a feel for how these 4 approaches to defending the faith work, and what the differences are, and the strengths and weaknesses of them are. So yeah, really, really good.
Right. You might fall upon the can't we all just get along? Or you might say, oh, I've only been in this camp. What are these other camps that you're talking about? So this might open you up to possibility or close you off to possibilities. So I think that's the little bit of the hope of the authors as well. And so now we move on to chapter 8, which is talking about the apologists who emphasize facts. And our authors start out by saying, in the modern period, American evangelical apologetics has been dominated by the evidentialist approach. Its emphasis is on the presentation of Christianity as factual, as supportable or verifiable by the examination of the evidence. Just give me the evidence. Prove to me that there is a God. Let me take a DNA sample of his hair. Let him rearrange the stars to spell his name. And then, only then, will I bow down before him. Well, except maybe not, because it could be all an illusion. And how do I know this is God's hair? And, maybe Jesus never really existed, because I watched this movie about Zeitgeist, and it says that it's really Horus that was brought over, and Christian or Jewish people started to believe in this rising and falling God. So the evidentialist apologists want to present the evidence that actually what we know of historic Christianity falls right in line with orthodoxy. And we're able to know the truth that God exists and Jesus Christ is as the fulfillment of that expression.
Yeah, and when they talk about the modern period, they're not talking about the contemporary period, right? Like the 20th, 21st century or whatever. They're talking about the time after the medieval times, during the I would say 16th, 17th century, 18th century, that kind of stuff, into the 19th century. So that's what they're looking at with regard to the modern period. And that's when this particular approach dominated, because, as we will see, science was coming into its own, and this approach now is going to align itself with science.
Right. Right. So rather than defending the faith in two stages, as the classical apologist does, first by defining theism, then by defending specifically Christian claims, evidentialists use multiple lines of evidence to support Christian theism as a whole. And this isn't only the historical belief of Jesus existing, of him being arrested, dying on the cross, and being raised from the dead. Although an important point, this informs many different avenues of Christianity from an evidentialist point of view. So in this chapter, we'll examine the roots of evidentialist apologetics and consider briefly the thoughts of 5 modern evangelists.
Yeah,
Evidentialists.
good. So the historical roots of evidentialist here. Evidentialist apologetics, they tell us, may from one perspective be viewed as a subtype of classical apologetics. And as you just described, this two-step approach by the classical apologist, the evidentialist, they're going to tell us just uses the second step, basically, right, to give evidences and proof for Christianity. So both approaches, both the classical approach and the evidentialist approach, want to provide reasons for faith that are accessible to non-Christians. So that's the basic idea here. However, the evidentialist approach has, over the past 2 centuries, our authors mentioned, gradually emerged as a significantly different model of apologetics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, they may want to be included, and evidence from the evidentialists might be used by the classicalists, but they are a separate entity. And so, what caused them to be this separate entity? Why are they an offshoot? Why are they a new arisement? Why didn't just the classical model continue on? Well, the big thing is that they were defending against deism. So the impetus of the development of evidentialist apologetics was the rise of deism. By the early 18th century, modern science seemed to be explaining more and more about the natural world, requiring God as an explanation for things less and less. The enormous success of science encouraged many people to believe that eventually everything could be explained naturalistically. And so this is the God of the gaps idea. So, why was there lightning? Well, because God was angry and he was throwing down lightning bolts as a form of judgment. No, we have actually explained it with ions in the atmosphere, and actually they go up and down and up. And so we've taken God out of that explanation, and then further and further. And so soon we won't need a God because all things can be explained naturalistically. So thus eliminating the need to appeal to the existence of a supernatural creator to explain reality as we know it. Deism was then, in effect, a way station on the road to atheism. The deist allowed that God had created the world and initiated the process governing it, but denied that God was involved in the subsequent history of the creation of humanity. And so, obviously, if you're getting into a conversation about the role of Christianity in the early development of America, usually the retort is, well, all these guys were deists. Well, it's not exactly true. Some were deist, of course, but this blind watchmaker who winds up the watch of the universe, sets aside and walks off a stage left and never picks it back up again is what the evidentialists are going to be responding to in history here.
Right. So the idea here is that, as deism says, God kind of created everything, and as you mentioned, walked away. And now that allows you to believe in a God, but also hold to all these new scientific discoveries that were going on. Well, look, he just kind of winded it up, as you mentioned, and now all of these things are just working themselves out, right? And so to combat deism, apologists began constructing arguments defending the supernaturalism of biblical Christianity that were modeled after the sciences. So the idea essentially was to fight fire with fire, right? So this is the way science did it. This is the way science argued, and therefore we're going to use that as our methodology of arguing also. So fight fire with fire to show that a scientific approach to the Christian truth claims would vindicate the Christian truth claims of rationality. So the dominant work, our authors tell us, of apologetics to appear in this context was Joseph Butler's Analogy of Religion, written in 1736. And they suggest that Butler can arguably be called the father of evidentialism, even though, as we'll see throughout this chapter, his apologetic was only a precursor to the evidentialist approach.
Right. Butler's approach quickly became a dominant conservative Protestant apologetics, especially in the English-speaking countries. This line of argument was commonly called natural theology. William Paley, who lived between 1743 and 1805, presented a classic statement of this theistic argument in his Natural Theology. Paley argues that from the contrivances evident in nature, one may infer that God is one, personal, intelligent, omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, eternal, self-existent, spiritual, and good. So all those things can be derived from nature itself. Yeah. In his conclusion, he explains the purpose of this line of reasoning. And so if Paley might sound familiar for those who have watched the show before, Paley is one of the people that Lydia McGrew credits to her idea of undesigned coincidences. And we talked about her book, Hidden in Plain View, where she credits Paley for that line of apologetics. And so that's an internal look at Scripture and showing an evidentialist approach of saying these two authors at two different times in two different places talked about things that would line up and match that were undesigned, that they didn't collude to, and that actually informs more of a truth claim to them telling the truth. So if Paley sounds familiar to audience of this show, then we've talked about it there as well. I'll include her interview below in our information. So although Paley expects that most of his readers already believe in God, he suggests that when that belief is tested, it will be helpful to, as he says, to find a support in argument for what we have taken upon authority. So furthermore, studying nature in order to find evidence of God enhances our awareness of God's hand in everything around us, which does fall in line with our even the presuppositionalist's favorite passage of Romans 1, where it talks about that God can be seen in nature as well, but also specifically in specific special revelation. So, but even Calvin would starts out his institutes by talking about the sense of God as well. And so for evidentialists, they tend to view this sensus divinitas more as an outward expression first, and then an inward probably second. But here, the Romans 1 aspect for all these different aspects of God, what Paley is saying, can be noticed just by observing nature as well.
Yeah, good. And along these same lines, our authors tell us there was the rise of the legal evidence model, right? So Paley's argument was representative of a century-long trend of apologists developing historical inductive arguments defending the biblical miracles, and of course, especially the resurrection of Jesus. But the epistemological basis, right, the study of knowledge here, for such apologetic arguments was the British empiricism pioneered by the philosopher John Locke. And so you'll recall that Locke was a representational realist with regard to his epistemology. He felt like there was a real world that existed out there, and that we represented the real world with the ideas that we had in our minds, right? And we got those representations as a result of our sense experience. And thus, that's what empiricism is all about, right? Knowledge comes through sense experience. And so Locke's own approach to apologetics was classical. In fact, our book tells us in form, right? The two-step approach. But apologists after Locke often applied his empiricist approach to general knowledge to the defense of Christianity.
Right. Well, and then Thomas Sherlock's book, The Trial of the Witness of the Resurrection of Jesus, which was published in 1729, set the tone for what followed. As the title indicates, Sherlock argues that the historicity of the resurrection on the model of a court trial, which, is still kind of our model that we bring about today. J. Warner Wallace has this form as well. You have God in the Docks by C.S. Lewis. This 1729 book has really kind of formed the basis for looking at the resurrection or the life of Jesus, and is still being used today. The thrust of the apologetic case here was simple. An impartial jury examining the evidence as one would in a court of law would have concluded that Jesus rose from the dead. Sherlock argued that the resurrection was a historical event subject to verification by human investigation, a thing to be judged on by men's senses, is what he said. So he is saying that if you look at this impartially, as a jury would for any sort of a trial, it's not just the preponderance of the evidence, but it would be a greater form of evidence would show that this is beyond reasonable doubt, that one would conclude that Jesus rose from the dead. And if he rose from the dead, it's more likely than not that what he said about himself was applicable, and therefore God existed, and it's the truth of it could be fully found in the person and the work of Jesus Christ.
Right, exactly. In fact, another figure of note, our book tells us, was Simon Greenleaf, right? He was a Harvard professor of legal evidence who took Sherlock's approach to the resurrection to new heights in his book that he wrote in 1874, The Testimony of the Evidentialists, right? And so, in fact, many people have probably heard of Simon Greenleaf, right? Greenleaf's arguments continue to be read and cited by both scholarly and popular evidentialist apologists to this day. And so his book, in fact, was recently reprinted, as our authors tell us.
Right. Well, and then we move to Joseph Butler, probably a really prominent name here that we've discussed about him kind of kicking off this approach. But the Christian apologist who pioneered evidentialist approach was Joseph Butler. He lived between 1692 and 1752. In 1736, Butler published The Analogy of Religion, Natural and Revealed, to the Constitution and Course of Nature. So, 17th century authors love these long titles. And if you've read Puritan literature, you know that sometimes even book titles contain a semicolon in there to continue on the title. Well, it was the most important work contributing to a radical shift in British apologetics away from metaphysical, rationalistic argumentation to more scientific, empirical form of reasoning.
Mm-hmm. And so our authors tell us that it's critical that Butler's argument be seen in its context. Butler used analogy, not to prove Christianity true, and not to provide a foundation for revealed religion, but to answer the objection that revealed religion is irrational, right? So notice this is he wasn't attacking whether or not God existed and that sort of thing. All he was suggesting, or at least trying to show, is that Christianity was not irrational. And so Butler thought to show that the deist, right, who admits the creation of the world by God, so he didn't need to argue for that, is being irrational in denying the divine origin of biblical revelation. Or at the very least, he had to answer objections against revelation, right?
Yeah. Butler's book is divided into two major parts, dealing with natural religion and revealed religion, respectively. So natural and revealed. So again, the Romans 1 aspect is shining forth here. Well, part 1 deals with life after death, arguing for the rationality of believing that rewards and punishments will be meted out by God based on our conduct in this life. And then part 2 argues from analogies with nature that revelation, like nature, will contain things that seem problematic but are nevertheless true and should be accepted. Butler argued, for example, that the lack of the universality in the Christian religion, the fact that it is not known to all human beings, is not a valid objection against its truth. So,
right, just like there are scientific truths that aren't known to all human beings, so there are, the Christian revelation, there are truths there that are not known to all human beings, right?
Right.
Yeah. And they tell us that only in chapter 7 of part 2 did Butler offer positive evidences and arguments for Christianity. Excuse me. He began by arguing that biblical history should be presumed accurate in the absence of evidence to the contrary. Again, he was writing to thwart deism, so there was this, assumption of of God's existence. So he argues that biblical history should be presumed accurate. And he noted that Christianity appears fairly unique in having been founded on the belief in miracles, for instance, in contrast especially to Islam, which, does not view Muhammad as a miraculous figure. While admitting that none of these arguments is a proof by itself, Butler averred that taking cumulatively, right, together, they form a strong proof, right? So this is the cumulative kind of approach where you look at all of these lines of evidence and you look at them together, and now you have a strong proof. Another line of evidence for the truth of Christianity is the fact of the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, for instance, right? And so Butler concluded in the Analogy of Religion with a chapter emphasizing that he had been answering objections and not providing absolute proof, right? Again, so notice what he does here is he weakens his claim, right? Christianity is rational. Not that I'm showing that God exists or that sort of thing, that it's absolutely true or whatever, but it's rational. And so with a weaker claim, you can have stronger arguments. And so that's the kind of idea that he's working on here.
Which might lead into our maybe negative approach a little bit, but we'll get there when we get there.
Yeah.
Well, we conclude our authors by emphasizing 4 points about Butler's method. First, his approach was empirical, not rationalistic, and the character of his conclusions was that the probability, not certainty. So he was going for the more likelihood of the case is that Christianity was true. Second, Butler employed this empirical, inductive, and probabilistic approach in a defensive mode of apologetic reasoning. He was there to strike down claims and not provide fully positive claims. His goal was not to prove Christianity true, but to prove that deistic charges that Christianity was irrational were unfounded. Again, the main crux that they were responding to was not atheism, it was deism. And so that might also account a little bit for his maybe weaker claim, just because there's probably a little bit more shared common ground there than with atheism.
Yeah. Third, Butler candidly stated that he was attempting to respond to the deists on their own ground, right? So there's your common ground kind of statement there. He says, I have argued upon the principles of others, not my own, right? And thus one should not conclude then that Butler was claiming that Christianity requires an empirical defense or that its truth cannot be accepted on other grounds. And then fourthly, Butler assumed the existence of God, an assumption he could make because, again, his opponents granted that assumption. They were deists. He was therefore not claiming to mount a defense of Christianity that would withstand the scrutiny of, for instance, the hardline atheists.
Well, then moving from Butler to James Orr, who lived from 1844 to 1913, so getting into the 20th century. He was a Scottish pastor and scholar who eventually became a noted professor of apologetics and theology in Glasgow during the early parts of the 20th century. In his classic apologetic book, The Christian View of God and the World as Centering in the Incarnation, again, shorten up the title, Orr sought to defend the Christian worldview by appealing to the facts. So again, here's our just the facts. Orr was who endorsed Butler's argument in the Analogy of Religion, emphasized that faith in Christ commits the believer to a whole theology and worldview that needs to be defended. So again, we're still saying worldview and a theology is important, and here Orr is emphasizing that a bit more than what Butler is.
Right, and so Orr, our authors tell us, is confident that the facts properly presented can be used to show that the Christianity are without merit. He writes, the reason why Christianity cannot be waved out of the world at the bidding of skeptics simply is that the facts are too strong for that attempt. The theories which would explain Christianity away make shipwreck on the facts, right? They run into the facts and therefore they crash and burn.
Right. And we'll see you next time.
See you next time.